There are 25 things I do on this land every year that would technically put me on the wrong side of some code enforcement officer's clipboard in most towns in this country. Catching rain in a barrel, curing my own meat, digging a well by hand. None of it stopped working. It just stopped being legal to do without asking somebody's permission first. My grandfather never asked. He just did it, because that's how a family stayed fed and warm before convenience took over. Now, I want to be straight with you before we get into this list. I'm not telling you to break any law where you live. Rules are different county to county, state to state, and some of them exist for real reasons, even if plenty of them just exist because somebody in an office decided self-sufficiency was a liability to manage. What I'm telling you is that every one of these 25 tricks kept a family alive for generations, and most of them still work exactly the same way today, permit or no permit. 100 years ago, nobody was asking permission to catch rain off their own roof or smoke a ham in their own yard. Self-reliance wasn't a lifestyle choice back then, it was just Tuesday. It's only in the last few generations that we built a whole system of codes, licenses, and inspections around things a person used to just know how to do on their own land. Some of that came from real safety lessons. A lot of it came from convenience taking the place of competence. I've spent most of my adult life out here without relying much on the grid, and I can tell you the first thing that goes when the power's out or the store shelves are empty isn't food. It's the knowledge of how to get by without either. These 25 tricks are the ones I still lean on, the ones that got quietly pushed out of common practice, not because they failed, but because they got replaced by something you could just buy instead. So let's go through them, one at a time, starting with the ones tied to water. Because nothing on a piece of land matters more than what you can catch, dig, or pull out of the ground yourself. I'll tell you how it's done the old way, and where the modern rulebook usually gets nervous about it. 25 tricks, starting now. The same way my grandfather would have walked you through his own back 41 chore at a time. No rush. Trick number 1 is catching rainwater off your own roof. And in more places than you'd expect, that's regulated water you supposedly don't fully own the rights to once it hits your gutter. My grandmother kept a line of barrels under every downspout on the property, covered with mesh to keep the mosquitoes out, and that water did the wash, watered the garden, and in a pinch, got boiled for drinking. She never called it a system, she called it common sense. The trick isn't just the barrel, it's the setup. A first flush diverter so the roof grit and bird mess wash away before the clean water starts filling the barrel, and a dark-colored container so algae doesn't take over in the sun. Screen every opening, because mosquitoes will find standing water faster than you'd believe. In dry country, that catchment can mean the difference between a green garden in August and a brown one. Permit or no permit on the paperwork. Trick number 2, and this one scares people more than it should. Digging your own well by hand. Before drilling rigs, that's exactly how it got done, with a shovel, a bucket, and a lot of patience. Usually going down anywhere from 20 to 40 feet depending on where the water table sat. It's slow, it's genuinely dangerous if you don't shore up the walls as you go, and I want to be clear that this is a job to research thoroughly and never attempt alone or without proper cribbing. Done right, a hand-dug well gives you water access with no electric pump standing between you and a drink, which matters a great deal when the power's been out for a week and everybody else is hauling jugs from town. The old-timers lined the shaft with stone or brick as they descended, both to keep the walls from collapsing and to filter the water a little on its way in. It's the kind of project that takes a season, not a weekend, but it never runs out of batteries. Trick number 3 is the root cellar, dug straight into a hillside or bermed into the ground, and it's still one of the smartest pieces of engineering I know that requires no electricity at all. The ground a few feet down stays close to 50 degrees year-round, no matter what the thermometer says outside, which means potatoes, carrots, apples, and squash keep for months without a refrigerator doing a single bit of work. Most modern building codes have a lot to say about underground structures, but the physics haven't changed since the first settler dug one. The trick to building one that lasts is drainage, more than anything else. You want the cellar dug into a slope, so water runs away from the door, instead of pooling against it. And you want at least a foot of soil over the roof for insulation, sitting on beams that can actually bear that load. This is not a place to guess at the framing. Vent it top and bottom so air moves through slowly. And keep root vegetables in sand or straw, not stacked bare against each other. My own cellar is dug into the rise behind the cabin, and I can walk out there in the dead of a hard winter and pull out apples that still snap when you bite them, stored since October, with nothing keeping them but dirt and darkness. That's the whole trick. Cold, dark, humid, and still air. 4 things nature already knows how to provide for free if you just dig down and let it do the work, instead of paying somebody else's electric bill to do it worse. Trick number 4. Making your own soap from wood ash and rendered fat, which sounds primitive until you realize it's just straightforward chemistry your great-grandmother did without a chemistry degree. You leach water through hardwood ash to pull out the lye, called potash back then, and that lye reacts with rendered tallow or lard to turn it into actual soap through a process called saponification. Store-bought lye makes it far more predictable today, but the old way with ash still works if you're patient and careful with the strength of your solution. The part people skip is the safety, and I won't skip it here. Lye is caustic enough to burn skin and eyes badly, so you handle it with gloves, eye protection, and good ventilation, always adding lye to water, and never the reverse, because that reaction can splash. Once it's cured for several weeks, though, what you're left with is a bar that cleans dishes, clothes, and skin, made from things most households used to throw away, not something you had to drive anywhere or hand money to anyone for. Trick number 5 is processing your own meat at home, start to finish, which in a lot of counties now runs straight into rules about licensed facilities if you intend to sell any of it. For your own family's table, though, home butchering is exactly how it was done for generations, and it starts with a calm animal, a sharp knife, and a plan for every single cut before you make the first one, because hesitation is where mistakes happen and meat gets wasted. The old-timers didn't waste anything, and that's the piece of this that's mostly disappeared. Organs got used for dishes most people today wouldn't recognize. Bones went straight into the stock pot, and fat got rendered down for cooking and for soap like we just talked about. A hog or a deer, handled with real respect for the animal and real attention to cleanliness, fed a family for months when it was cured and smoked properly, not just eaten fresh over a couple of weeks. If you're new to it, do not learn this alone from a video. Apprentice with somebody who's actually done it, because knife safety and proper bleeding and cooling of the meat are the difference between good food and a serious health risk. What I can tell you is that once you've broken down your own animal, you look at meat in a grocery cooler differently. You start to understand exactly what you're paying for when you pay somebody else to do this work. Trick number 6, and this one trips up more suburban homesteaders than any other item on this list, is keeping chickens in town. A surprising number of municipal codes still restrict or flat-out ban backyard poultry, sometimes over noise, sometimes over smell, sometimes just because somebody decided livestock and lawns don't belong in the same zip code. My grandparents kept a small coop behind nearly every house on their street, and eggs got traded up and down the block like currency. The trick to doing it quietly, where it is allowed, is a tight coop, a deep layer of bedding you turn into compost, and skipping the rooster entirely, because hens lay just fine without one, and a rooster is what turns a quiet backyard into a neighborhood complaint. 3 or 4 hens can supply a family with eggs every single day. No grid required, no grocery run required, just scraps from the kitchen and a little grain to round out their diet. Trick number 7 is home distilling, and I'll say this plainly. In the United States, distilling spirits without a federal permit is genuinely illegal. Full stop. No gray area. Regardless of what you've heard about personal use exemptions that exist for beer and wine, but not for spirits. I'm including it on this list because it is, without question, one of the most common things our grandparents' generation did, quietly on their own land, and the mechanics of it are worth understanding even if you never touch a still yourself. The basic process is fermentation followed by distillation. You ferment a mash of grain, fruit, or sugar into a low-alcohol liquid, then heat it so the alcohol vaporizes at a lower temperature than the water and condenses back into a stronger spirit through a coiled tube. It sounds simple, and mechanically it is. which is exactly why it spread through rural communities the way it did, especially in places where cash was scarce but corn was not. The real danger, historically and today, isn't the law, it's the chemistry done wrong. Improperly separating the early and late portions of a distillation run can concentrate methanol to dangerous levels, and that's what actually hurt people in the old days, not the moonshine itself done carefully. I'm not walking you through a how-to here, because this is one skill where getting it wrong doesn't just cost you a fine, it can cost you your health. And that's not a trade I'd ever recommend making. Trick number 8 is trapping and snaring for food, which used to be as ordinary as fishing and is now tightly regulated almost everywhere, with seasons, license requirements, and rules about which species and which methods are even legal in your state. That regulation exists for good reason in most places. Overtrapping nearly wiped out several fur-bearing species a century ago, and the rules brought a lot of those populations back. Where it's legal and in season, though, the old techniques still work exactly the way they always did. A simple snare set on a game trail, positioned at the right height for the animal you're targeting, has fed people for longer than firearms have existed. The trick old trappers relied on was reading the land itself, the worn paths, the tracks in soft mud, the places where cover narrows into a natural funnel, rather than any fancy equipment. Check your local regulations before you set anything, because this is one of the tricks where the rules genuinely protect something worth protecting. Trick number 9 is the burn barrel, a simple metal drum with air holes punched in the sides, used to handle trash and yard waste without a garbage truck ever coming down the driveway. Plenty of counties restrict or ban open burning now, mostly over air quality and wildfire risk. And depending on where you live, that restriction is worth respecting even if it feels inconvenient. Where it's still legal, it remains one of the most direct ways to deal with waste without depending on a weekly pickup service. The trick to running one safely is location and attention. Set it well clear of structures, dry brush, and low branches. Keep a hose or a few buckets of water within reach the entire time. And never walk away while it's burning, because a shift in the wind can turn a manageable fire into a real problem in under a minute. My grandfather burned his barrel on the same bare patch of gravel for 30 years, and that patch never once got out of hand. Trick number 10 is the composting outhouse, which most modern septic codes have very specific opinions about, especially anywhere near a water source. Done properly, though, it's a genuinely closed-loop system. Waste breaks down with the help of sawdust or wood ash added after each use, turning into safe compost over the better part of a year, rather than sitting in a tank waiting on a pump truck. It uses no water at all, which matters enormously, anywhere water is scarce or the well runs shallow. The trick that makes it actually pleasant instead of unpleasant is the carbon layer. A scoop of dry sawdust after every use controls both the smell and the moisture, and a vent pipe running up above the roofline pulls odor up and out instead of back into the structure. Placement matters too, well away from any well or stream, on higher ground so nothing ever runs toward water. It's not glamorous, but it's one of the most self-contained systems on this whole list. Trick number 11 is building your own structure from raw materials on the land itself, without pulling a building permit, which in most jurisdictions today is a genuinely gray area, depending on the size of the structure and whether you intend to live in it full time. A small cabin, a smokehouse, or a shed built from timber you felled and milled yourself was simply how outbuildings got made for most of American history, long before anyone required a stamped drawing to put a roof over a woodpile. The old method leaned heavily on what was standing on the property already: notched log corners instead of metal fasteners, a stone or gravel footing instead of poured concrete, and a roof pitched steep enough to shed snow without a single truss bought from a lumber yard. None of that is a shortcut around good building sense, though. A structure that's going to hold weight, whether it's snow load or a person living inside it, still has to be built by someone who genuinely understands loads and joints, not guessed at. What I'll tell you from having built my own outbuildings this way is that it slows you down in a good way. You start noticing which trees are straight enough to use, which ones have rot you can't see from the bark, and which joints actually need to be tighter than you first cut them. Check your local codes before you commit to anything permanent. because the gray area I mentioned earlier can turn into a real problem if the structure is discovered later and doesn't meet minimum safety standards. Trick number 12 is tanning your own hides, a skill that's nearly vanished from ordinary households and survives mostly among trappers, hunters, and a stubborn handful of us who'd rather not throw away half of what an animal gave us. There are a few traditional methods, but the one that shows up most in old homestead records is brain tanning, which sounds strange until you learn that an animal's brain contains almost exactly the right balance of natural oils needed to soften its own hide. The process starts with fleshing the hide completely clean of fat and tissue, then soaking it in a bath that breaks down the fibers, working the softened brain mixture into the skin by hand, and then the real labor begins, stretching and working the hide for hours as it dries, because that constant working is what keeps the fibers from binding back together stiff. Skip that step and you end up with something closer to cardboard than leather. The last stage is smoking the hide over a low, smoldering fire, which sets the tan permanently and makes the leather water-resistant in a way that oils alone can't manage. A well-tanned hide, done completely by hand, can become clothing, cordage, or bedding that lasts for years, using nothing that didn't come off the animal itself. It's slow work, genuinely smelly work, and one of the clearest examples I know of a skill that quietly disappeared the moment leather got cheap to buy. Trick number 13 is salt curing and smoking meat, the original refrigeration, and it still works exactly the way it did before anyone had a chest freezer humming in the garage. Salt draws moisture out of meat through basic osmosis, and without that moisture, the bacteria that cause spoilage simply can't establish themselves the way they would in fresh meat left out. A proper dry cure, packed heavily in salt for days depending on thickness, can preserve meat for months without a single kilowatt of electricity involved. Smoke adds a second layer of protection on top of the salt, both from the antimicrobial compounds in the smoke itself and from the slow drying that happens as meat hangs in that low, steady heat for hours or sometimes days. My smokehouse runs on nothing but hardwood coals and patience, and a properly cured, properly smoked ham from that shed will outlast almost anything sitting in a refrigerator, right up until the day you finally decide to eat it. Trick number 14 is foraging on public land, which is legal in a lot of places but comes with real limits most people never bother to look up. Daily harvest caps, restricted areas, and species that are protected outright depending on the forest or park. Where it's allowed, foraging put real food on the table for generations, from berries and nuts to greens that most people today would walk straight past without a second glance, because they've simply never been taught what's actually edible around them. I want to be very clear on this one, because it's the single most dangerous trick on this whole list if you get it wrong. Never eat anything you can't identify with total certainty, using more than one reliable source, and ideally someone experienced with your local plants, because several toxic species look enough like edible ones to fool a confident beginner. Foraging is a real skill worth learning slowly and carefully, not a shortcut to a free meal on your first afternoon out. Trick number 15 is saving and trading heirloom seeds, and this one gets legally complicated in a way most people don't expect, because certain hybrid and patented varieties are actually protected, and replanting or sharing their seeds can violate the agreement you agreed to just by buying the seed packet. Heirloom, open-pollinated varieties don't carry that restriction though, and saving their seed year after year is exactly how gardens got planted for most of human history, long before anyone thought to put a patent on a tomato. The trick to saving seed properly is letting a portion of your best plants go fully to seed instead of harvesting everything for eating, then drying those seeds completely before storing them somewhere cool, dark, and dry, usually in a paper envelope rather than plastic, which traps moisture and rots the seed inside. My grandmother kept an entire tin box of envelopes, each one labeled by hand, and half of what grows in my garden today traces straight back to seeds she saved 40 years ago. Trick number 16 is bartering instead of trading in cash, which technically still has tax implications. The IRS expects you to report on the fair market value of goods or services exchanged, even though almost nobody actually does. Rural communities ran on this for generations regardless. Eggs for milk, labor for lumber, a repaired fence for a sack of grain, building a kind of local economy that didn't depend on anyone having actual money in their pocket at the moment they needed something. What made it work wasn't a formal system, it was reputation. A man who traded fair got offered fair trades back, and a man who shorted his neighbor once found doors closing all over the county pretty quickly. That kind of accountability doesn't show up on a receipt, but it built trust that lasted longer than most contracts do. Even today, I still trade firewood for fresh vegetables with a neighbor down the road. No cash ever changes hands, and neither of us minds. Trick number 17 is making your own cordage from plant fiber, which sounds like a minor skill until you realize rope and string were once genuinely expensive, hard to replace goods that a household needed constantly for everything, from securing loads to building shelter. Dogbane, milkweed, nettle, and the inner bark of certain trees all yield usable fiber once you strip, dry, and process them properly, and the resulting cordage, twisted tight in the right pattern, can hold real weight. The trick to strong cordage is the reverse wrap twist, twisting one strand away from you while wrapping it over the second strand, alternating which strand you twist as you go, which locks the fibers together instead of letting them slip apart under tension. It takes practice to get consistent thickness, but once you've made rope from a plant you pulled out of the ground yourself, buying a hardware store spool starts to feel like paying for something you were fully capable of making. Trick number 18 is building a cistern, essentially a much larger, more permanent version of the rain barrel we covered earlier, usually dug or built partially underground to store hundreds or even thousands of gallons, collected off a roof over an entire season. Depending on your state, cisterns can run into the same water rights questions rain barrels do, so it's worth checking local rules before building anything substantial, but where they're allowed, they turn an entire roof into a genuine reservoir. The old cisterns were often lined with lime plaster or built from brick, specifically because those materials help keep the water sweet rather than stagnant, and a tight-fitting lid mattered just as much as the tank itself, keeping out sunlight, debris, and anything that might want to nest inside. A full cistern going into winter meant a family wasn't hauling water from a frozen creek or a shared well every single morning, which, in a hard winter, was no small thing. Trick number 19 is home canning without any official inspection, and I want to say clearly that this is entirely legal for personal use in the United States. It's only commercial sale of home canned goods that runs into licensing requirements in most states. What matters far more than any inspector ever could is following tested canning times and pressures exactly, because improperly canned low-acid foods can develop botulism, a genuinely dangerous risk that has nothing to do with permission and everything to do with getting the process right. My pantry shelves are lined with jars of tomatoes, green beans, venison, and jam, all processed at home using methods and timing that go back generations, refined over time as we learn more about exactly what kills bacteria and what doesn't. A properly sealed jar, processed correctly, will keep food safe for a year or more, sitting on a shelf, with no electricity involved at all, which is exactly the kind of security that used to be considered basic household competence. Trick number 20 is making candles from tallow, the same rendered animal fat we talked about back in the soap-making trick, because on a self-sufficient homestead, almost nothing goes to just one use. Before affordable wax and electricity, tallow candles lit most American homes after dark, made by repeatedly dipping a wick into melted fat and letting each layer cool before the next, building thickness gradually over dozens of passes rather than pouring it all at once. Tallow candles do smoke more and burn a little faster than wax, which is exactly why beeswax eventually became the preferred choice for anyone who could afford it. But tallow was what most households actually had on hand from butchering their own animals anyway. It's a good example of how a lot of these old tricks weren't chosen because they were the best possible option. They were chosen because they used what a family already had, without spending money they didn't have to spend. Trick number 21 is split rail fencing. Built entirely from logs split lengthwise with wedges and a mallet, stacked in a zigzag pattern that needs no nails, no post holes, and no metal at all to stay standing for decades. Dwayne here, Dry Creek Wrangler School. Let me ask you a question. Do souls. Property line disputes today usually require a licensed survey before you build anything permanent along a boundary. So that part of the old approach, just stacking a fence where it made sense to you, doesn't always hold up the way it used to legally. The zigzag design, sometimes called a worm fence, gets its strength purely from the angle and the weight of the rails resting against each other, which means it can be built and repaired by one person, with basic hand tools and no fasteners of any kind. It's not the most space-efficient design, since the zigzag eats up ground on both sides, but for keeping livestock contained on rough, rocky land where digging post holes was nearly impossible, it was hard to beat. Trick number 22 is the smoke shed, a small dedicated structure separate from the house, built specifically for the slow curing process we talked about earlier with meat preservation. Keeping that fire and that smoke in its own building mattered for two real reasons. Fire safety, since you're running a low smolder for hours or days at a stretch, and keeping that heavy smoke smell out of the house where people were actually living and sleeping every night. A good smoke shed is small on purpose, tight enough to hold smoke density without much airflow. With vents you can adjust to control temperature rather than let it run hot. Most were built from the same rough lumber as everything else on the property, sometimes with a dirt floor and a simple smoldering pit dug right into the ground beneath the hanging meat. It's one more example of a single-purpose building that quietly disappeared once refrigeration made the whole process unnecessary. Trick number 23 is making your own charcoal in an earthen pit, a slower, hotter-burning fuel than raw wood that was essential for blacksmithing, cooking, and heating long before bagged charcoal showed up at the hardware store. The basic method involves stacking wood tightly in a pit or mound, covering it with dirt or sod to limit the oxygen reaching it, and letting it smolder for hours rather than burn freely, which drives off moisture and volatile compounds without consuming the wood entirely. Getting the airflow right is the whole trick. Too much oxygen and the wood just burns to ash. Too little and it never converts properly. So old charcoal makers controlled it with small vent holes they'd open and close as the burn progressed, reading the smoke color to know when it was working. What comes out the other end burns far hotter and cleaner than raw wood, which mattered enormously for anyone forging their own tools rather than buying them ready-made. Trick number 24 is the traditional outhouse, the simplest version of the waste system we discussed earlier with composting, and one that most modern health codes have replaced entirely with municipal sewer or septic requirements almost everywhere people actually live. A basic pit privy, dug deep enough and sited well away from any water source, handled generations of rural households with nothing more complicated than a hole, a seat, and eventually moving the structure once that pit filled and needed to rest. The placement mattered more than almost anything else about it, downhill and downstream from any well, far enough from the house to manage the smell, but close enough to actually use in bad weather, and dug in soil that would drain rather than hold water and contaminate the ground around it. It's easy to laugh at the outhouse now, but it kept water sources clean for households that had no other option, and the basic siting rules still matter if you ever build one today. Trick number 25, and the last one on this list, is the storm cellar, often the very same dugout we talked about for root storage, doing double duty as shelter when the weather turned dangerous. In tornado country especially, a below-ground space with a solid door and a way to brace it from the inside saved more lives than any siren ever did, long before weather radios and cell phone alerts gave people minutes of warning instead of none at all. Building one properly means real structural thought, not just a hole with a lid. Reinforced walls, a roof that can bear real weight from above, and a door that opens inward or slides rather than one that could get blocked by debris from outside. It's the kind of project you research thoroughly and probably build with someone who understands load-bearing structures, because this is a place your family's safety actually depends on, not a spot to guess at the framing. Looking back over all 25 of these, what strikes me most isn't how clever any single one of them is. It's how ordinary they used to be. None of this was considered impressive knowledge 2 or 3 generations back. It was just what you knew. The same way you knew how to drive a car or use a telephone. The skills didn't get harder to learn. They got easier to ignore, because for the first time in human history, you could pay somebody else to know them instead. The cost of that trade is easy to miss until the moment it actually matters. A storm knocks out power for a week, a store shelf sits empty longer than expected, or money gets tight enough that buying your way out of a problem simply isn't an option anymore. That's usually the exact moment people realize competence isn't something you can order overnight, and a skill sitting in your own hands can't get back-ordered, recalled, or shut off at the breaker. I'm not asking anybody to go dig a well in their backyard tomorrow or start distilling anything, and plenty of these are genuinely regulated for reasons worth respecting. What I'd ask instead is that you don't let the knowledge disappear completely, even if you never actually use it. If you grew up watching a grandparent do any of these 25 differently than I described, or you've got one from your own family that didn't make this list, tell me about it in the comments, because I'd genuinely like to hear it. It makes me wonder what happens 3 or 4 generations from now, when even fewer people have watched somebody actually do any of this with their own 2 hands. Whether these tricks survive as something a few stubborn people keep alive on purpose, or fade out completely the way so much other household knowledge already has, mostly depends on whether anybody bothers to pass it down before the people who still know it are gone. Every one of these 25 tricks shares one thing underneath it. They all put the answer back in your own hands instead of somebody else's system. That's the whole appeal of this way of living. Not that it's easier, because it usually isn't, but that nobody can take a skill away from you the way they can take away a paycheck, a supply chain, or a permit. That's worth more to me than convenience ever has been. There's a lot more of this land still has to teach. And I'll keep bringing you along as I work through it. One chore, one fire, one season at a time. If any of this is new to you, stick around and keep learning it with me. Because knowing how used to be common, and there's no reason it can't be again. I'll see you out here next time.